When a man dismisses your feelings instead of understanding them, it's not a communication problem. It's a respect problem. And that distinction matters because what you're dealing with isn't about misunderstanding each other. It's about how much space he's willing to make for your emotional reality. A man who values you doesn't just hear your words. He listens to your meaning. He listens for the emotion underneath. He listens to understand, not to defend. But when a man minimizes your feelings, saying things like, "You're overreacting," "It's not that deep," or "You always make everything a problem," he's sending a clear message: your emotions are inconvenient to me. And the moment your emotions become inconvenient to someone, you're no longer being cared for, you're being controlled. That kind of dismissal may sound small on the surface, but psychologically, it's corrosive. Over time, you begin to internalize the message that your emotions are wrong. You start editing yourself before you even speak. You begin to shrink in conversations, apologize for expressing pain, and doubt your own perception. That's not love. That's slow emotional erosion. When a man repeatedly invalidates you, he's not creating peace, he's creating silence. There's a big difference between calm and suppression. Calm is built on safety, suppression is built on fear, and a lot of people confuse the two because silence looks peaceful. But silence that's built on fear is just anxiety on mute. You can't build intimacy in an environment where one person is always walking on eggshells. Emotional connection requires emotional freedom, the freedom to feel without being judged or dismissed. When that freedom disappears, the relationship becomes one-sided. One person expresses, the other evaluates, one person feels, the other controls the emotional temperature. What makes this so dangerous is how easily it can disguise itself as maturity. A man who doesn't value your feelings might say, "I'm just being logical," or "I'm trying to keep the peace." But what he's really saying is, "I care more about being comfortable than being connected." And comfort, in that sense, becomes his shield against accountability. Emotional maturity isn't about avoiding difficult emotions. It's about handling them with grace. A man who truly values you doesn't need to agree with every feeling you have, but he will respect them. Because validation isn't about agreement. It's about acknowledgement. It's saying, "I see that you feel this way, and your feelings make sense given your experience." That's what creates trust. That's what builds emotional safety. The truth is, most people don't know how to sit with someone else's emotions because they've never learned how to sit with their own. When a man dismisses your feelings, it's often because your emotions confront something in him that he doesn't want to face. Guilt, fear, inadequacy, maybe even shame. So, instead of processing that discomfort, he deflects it back to you. He labels your emotion as an overreaction so he doesn't have to examine his behavior. But let's be clear, your emotions are not a burden. They are data, they are signals. They reveal your needs, your boundaries, your sense of safety. And when someone tells you that your feelings are too much, what they're really saying is, "I'm not equipped to handle real connection." Real love requires emotional labor, not the kind that drains you, but the kind that invests in understanding. It's the willingness to pause before reacting, to ask questions instead of deflecting blame, to make the effort to understand how your actions might impact the person you care about. And when that doesn't exist, you'll notice something subtle but powerful. Your relationship stops feeling like a partnership and starts feeling like a performance. You start managing his reactions instead of expressing your truth. You start prioritizing his comfort over your clarity. And eventually, you begin to lose yourself, not all at once, but piece by piece. This is why emotional validation is so crucial, not just for connection, but for identity. When someone values your emotions, they're telling you, you matter. Your inner world matters. What you feel is worth my attention. That acknowledgement grounds you in your own humanity. It keeps you anchored in self-trust. When that's missing, you drift. You start doubting your own reality, and once you start doubting your reality, you become easy to manipulate. Not because you're weak, but because you're compassionate. You keep giving benefit of the doubt. You keep trying to explain better. and you keep believing that if you just communicate more clearly, he'll finally understand. But communication doesn't fix contempt, and understanding can't grow where respect doesn't exist. You can't teach someone to value what they've already decided is optional. You can explain your feelings 100 times, but if he doesn't care to understand, the issue isn't clarity, it's care. So the real question isn't, how do I make him understand me? The real question is, why am I trying to convince someone who doesn't want to understand? Because a man who values you doesn't need to be convinced. He wants to understand. He may not always get it right, but you'll see his effort. You'll see his humility. You'll see that he values the connection more than his comfort. And that's what emotional respect looks like when understanding you becomes more important than being right. You deserve that kind of emotional safety. The kind where your vulnerability isn't used against you, where your emotions are not labeled as problems but received as parts of your truth. Because love without understanding is just attachment with confusion. So if you find yourself constantly defending your emotions in a relationship, take a step back and ask, why do I have to justify being human? Because that's what your feelings are, human, not dramatic, not excessive, just real. You deserve someone who doesn't flinch when you express them. Someone who sees your feelings not as an inconvenience, but as an invitation to know you deeper. Someone who doesn't need you to shrink just so he can stay comfortable. Because when a man values you, he values all of you, even the parts that are emotional, uncertain, or vulnerable. He knows that understanding you is part of loving you, and when he doesn't, silence becomes your answer. You don't need to argue your worth to someone who's already showing you they don't recognize it. Remember this, a man who truly values you will never make you feel like your emotions are the problem. He will treat them as the path to greater intimacy, respect, and connection. When a man takes consistently but rarely gives, you're not in a relationship, you're in a transaction. And what makes that dynamic dangerous is how quietly it starts. It never begins with him asking for too much. It begins with you giving just a little more than you receive, and convincing yourself that's what love is supposed to look like. But here's the truth, real love doesn't drain you, it expands you. When someone values you, they don't just take your energy, they replenish it. There's a mutual exchange of effort, care, and attention that keeps the connection alive. When that balance disappears, the relationship stops being a partnership and starts becoming a performance. One where you're constantly proving your worth through your effort, while he contributes just enough to keep you hoping. Psychologically, this kind of imbalance rewires your sense of value. You start believing that love is earned through endurance instead of mutual investment. You start seeing consistency as commitment, even when it's one-sided. And because you care, you make excuses. You tell yourself he's just busy, that he'll change, or that shows love differently. But love that only shows up when it's convenient isn't love, it's self-interest in disguise. The reason this feels confusing is because takers don't always look selfish. They often present as charming, confident, or emotionally independent. They'll do just enough to keep you emotionally engaged. A few sweet words here, a good moment there. But when it comes to sustained effort, they disappear. It's not that they don't know how to give. It's that they don't value giving unless it benefits them. And that's where you have to be brutally honest with yourself. You can't build a stable relationship on intermittent effort. Consistency is what builds trust. When a man values you, his actions align with his words, even when it's inconvenient. He doesn't wait for you to remind him to care. He doesn't treat your emotional needs as optional. He shows up, not because he has to, but because he wants to. The imbalance becomes most visible in the small, ordinary moments. You notice that the conversations always revolve around him. His problems, his opinions, his priorities. You notice that when you need emotional support, he's suddenly unavailable or dismissive. You find yourself doing the emotional labor, checking in, planning, forgiving, initiating. And deep down, you feel that subtle exhaustion that comes from always being the one who tries harder. That exhaustion isn't love wearing thin, it's clarity breaking through. It's your intuition reminding you that love shouldn't feel like one person constantly reaching across the distance while the other stands still. Philosophically, love has always been about reciprocity, a balance between giving and receiving. In healthy relationships, both people feed the bond. But when one person only takes, the relationship begins to hollow out from the inside. What's left looks like love, but it lacks nourishment. You keep pouring in time, energy, and forgiveness, and all you get back are moments of temporary reassurance, just enough to reset your hope. And here's where a lot of people get stuck. They confuse potential with proof. You see glimpses of what he could be, and that potential keeps you holding on. But potential doesn't build connection. Behavior does. Consistent effort is proof of value. A man who values you doesn't leave you questioning where you stand. He doesn't make you chase clarity. The deeper truth is, when someone constantly takes and rarely gives, what they're communicating is that your effort is expected, not appreciated. They've learned that you'll keep showing up even when they don't. And once someone becomes certain of your loyalty, they stop earning it. That's not partnership, that's entitlement. And entitlement always kills respect. Because when a man feels entitled to your energy, your patience, your forgiveness, he stops seeing them as gifts. He starts seeing them as guarantees. He stops putting in effort because, in his mind, effort is no longer necessary. This is where many people fall into what psychologists call the cycle of hope and disappointment. You give more, he gives less, and every time you try to pull back, he senses the distance and gives you just enough. A few kind words, a small gesture, to make you stay. That's not change, that's maintenance. He's maintaining access to you, not connection with you. It's not that he doesn't know how to give. It's that he's learned he doesn't have to. And you can't teach someone to appreciate what they've already decided to take for granted. You can only teach yourself what your energy is worth. This is why self-respect is so crucial. Because when you respect your energy, you stop offering it to people who don't reciprocate. You stop mistaking crumbs for effort. You stop giving passes to behavior that clearly shows indifference. There's a quiet strength in knowing when to stop giving. It doesn't mean you've become cold or unloving. It means you've become discerning. You've learned that real love doesn't require endless explanation. It requires balance. When a man truly values you, you'll feel it in his consistency. You won't have to beg for his time or interpret his silence. You'll see his care reflected in the way he remembers what matters to you, the way he checks in without being asked, the way he takes responsibility when he's wrong. His giving won't be perfect, but it will be present. And that's the difference between someone who values you and someone who uses you: presence. Presence is emotional investment. Presence is effort without prompting. Presence is when someone shows up because they want to understand you, not because they're afraid of losing you. When you stop receiving that kind of presence, that's your answer. Because absence always tells the truth. Here's something most people miss. Love isn't measured by how much you give. It's measured by how much both people grow from what they give. If the only one growing is the person who keeps taking, then you're not evolving. You're depleting. And the hardest truth to accept is this: sometimes the reason he keeps taking is because you keep allowing it. Your kindness, your patience, your forgiveness, all beautiful traits, can become the very tools someone uses to keep the balance in their favor. That's why boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. They protect your generosity from being exploited. You teach people how to value you by how you respond when they don't. If every time he gives less, you compensate by giving more, you're reinforcing the imbalance. But if you step back, if you stop pouring where there's no return, you create space for truth to surface. You'll see whether he values you, not by what he says, but by what he does when you stop overfunctioning. Because when someone truly values you, they'll notice your absence. When someone doesn't, they'll replace your presence. At the end of the day, effort is the language of value. A man who values you will speak that language fluently. He'll show up even when it's inconvenient. He'll give not because you ask, but because he understands that love without effort is just empty comfort. So don't measure love by words or moments. Measure it by effort, by reciprocity, by how consistently you feel seen and supported. Because love that constantly takes without giving isn't love. It's dependency dressed as devotion. And once you recognize that truth, the decision becomes clear: stop overextending for someone who's underinvested.